How's it going? I'm Ernie Lee. I'm going to be going over Chapter 4, Labor and Financial Markets. And with our team name, or our group is Make America Rage Again. So we're going to start out with labor markets here. You can see that labor markets are basically made up of the employees and the jobs, employees being the supply, and firms demanding that quantity for or to get done what they need to get done in order to accomplish what they want and make the profits that they want. So if you look at the graph here, we have our wages on our y-axis, quantity of workers on the x-axis. Now, if there was a shift along any of that line, there's say a demand, a shift in, or not, excuse me, not a shift in demand, but a movement along the demand curve there, it would definitely have an impact. For example, if the wages went up to $15 an hour or $14 an hour, you would see that the demand for workers would go down. So the firms wouldn't be asking for as many workers. They wouldn't be hiring as many workers. In conjunction with that raise in wages, we would see the supply of workers go up because they're trying to capitalize on the higher wages there. And that would lead to a surplus, another word for unemployment in this situation. On the other end of the spectrum, if we see wages drop, you would see that the demand for workers by firms would go up, and there would be, in conjunction with that, the supply of workers would go down. So then we would see a shortage shown here in that graph. So really the best deal for everyone is when wages are at that equilibrium. Now, some people are pushing for a living wage here, and I drew a living wage on there just to show what it would be like if we did increase wages to have that living wage. And as you can see, just like we talked about earlier, there'd be a surplus because firms wouldn't hire as many workers there. They say, I don't know if I already mentioned this in this video, but they say that for every 10% increase in wages, that 1 to 2% of workers aren't hired or are fired. So places around the country that are pushing for, nearly double the minimum wage that they already have, really they're going to hurt themselves. But of course, since we're so dependent these days, our tax dollars will pay for that. Somebody else will pay for that. Next, I'd like to talk about some of the variables that will shift demand. So shift the entire line. So we're not talking about different points on the demand curve anymore. So some of those things are really your output. So we'll focus on I guess let's just go through the decrease first. So there's decreases if there's a decrease in demand for output, you would see that the demand curve would shift to the left. That's really, in this market, the demand is called derivative demand just because there's going to have to be a need for a certain product. So for example, cassettes, there's really no demand for cassettes anymore. I'm sure when CDs came out, a lot of people lost their jobs just because of the fact that there was no demand there. Poorly trained workforce, that pretty much is self-explanatory. I've never heard of a demand for a poorly trained workforce or a lesser trained workforce. And then for technology, with technology, it really depends. If there's a substitution, like if there's a new technology that substitutes what a worker used to do, for example, when you go to a grocery store, there's self-checkouts all over the place. So now you have one person looking over 6 registers that used to have a worker there. So substitution can definitely decrease the demand for those workers. And a decrease in the number of companies. So a decrease in the number of companies would decrease, it'll decrease the labor demanded just because certain people fit certain skill sets, they would no longer be needed if there isn't as many companies. I guess in that case, there'd be pretty much scarcity when it comes to their career choice. Then government regulations that can decrease specific workers' valuability to the country or to the company. For example, if the government put strict regulations on schools and qualifying for a specific job, now the workers who don't have that training or education or whatever the government is now requiring are less valuable and there's less of a demand for them. Then another shift would really just be the availability of other inputs. So we're looking at, do companies have access to the things they need to get the job done, to be able to give workers what they need to get the job done, and get the output that they want there. So some of the things that can increase the demand there, it's pretty much the opposite of what we talked about with decreasing the demand. So, for example, you may have, what I was talking about with CDs becoming a big thing in the 90s. There was definitely an increase in demand there. So now, or demand for that product, and since this is the derivative demand, they needed to hire more workers. So there was a demand for the workforce there. Well-trained workforce as opposed to a poorly trained workforce, so obviously becoming more valuable, and that really has a lot to do with what kind of qualifications are needed, and that kind of goes hand in hand with the government regulations. So, for example, if the government is requiring certain people to have a certain skill set and be trained in that, makes them more valuable as opposed to the less trained workforce. So you see that the skill shift to the right. Technology, now this has to complement what they're doing, not like the cash registers that we're seeing today or self-checkout like I talked about in the past, but really just maybe computers, for example, you're able to store so much more information than having to go back and waste a whole bunch of valuable time filing something away. And increasing companies, so we talked about that on decreasing. So when companies are increased, you have more options. There's going to be more, there's going to be less of any type of obstacles for you to get to where you want to get. So there'd be less unemployment and all of that kind of stuff. And then government regulations. So if the government loosens up their regulations, it makes it so that more people are able to qualify for the job, and that increases the demand. So we're going to look at just some quick things on supply. It's extremely similar to the opposite side of the spectrum, but here we're just looking at supply of the workforce. So when wages increase, supply goes up because people are trying to take advantage of that, just like when wages decrease, demand goes up because of the fact that firms are trying to take advantage. So looking at supply here, we got an increase in workers will increase the supply of workers. Certain things like immigration laws, being less strict, and work visas and things like that are things that can increase the supply of workers. Less education being required, that's a big deal. If there isn't any type of restrictions on people having specific qualifications to work that job, then you have more of a pool to pick from. And that goes right hand in hand with the loose government policies there. A decrease in supply, we're looking at the same thing. However, we have less of a supply with the workers here. So a decrease in workers, so if Donald Trump builds his wall and it's like the craziest wall you've ever seen, we won't have as many immigrant workers getting those jobs, and we'll have. So yeah, there'll be less workers in that situation there. The supply there. If there's an increase in required education, that may persuade people from going into that career field. So again, there's less of a supply there. A supply of workers. And then strict government policies. Again, that's extremely similar. If the government comes up with new qualifications, that could make a lot of the workers not qualify for that job anymore and prevent, or lessen the supply of workers. Here, really quick, I just wanted to mention, I actually forgot in the beginning of this video, I put down a demand schedule just to show you the equilibrium where it would be at, it's basically the same exact thing as the graph. It is. It's just put in a table there. That's another tool you can use. So now looking at a financial market, so we got the borrowers and savers there, the borrowers being demanders and the savers being the suppliers. So obviously there's a billion reasons why somebody would want to borrow money, whether it's school or a house or a car. And then you have people that are trying to capitalize on that, on interest rates, called the savers, and they're willing to supply that money to you. So if you look at the graph here, you got interest on your y-axis and the quantity of borrowers on your x-axis. So as you see, the interest rate goes up, the amount of people willing to supply loans goes up also. And now when the interest rate goes down, there's a bigger demand for those loans, as you can see here. Almost all of the same rules that we talked about over in the labor market are pretty similar, actually extremely similar with how this operates. I gave a couple examples of how we'll see a shift in that line here. You know, we got, for example, Social Security that was actually used in the book. Social Security will actually decrease the supply of money being invested because people are now relying on a check from the government after they retire. Now, let's say Social Security fails like so many believe it will. I would expect that a lot more people would want to invest their money and try to take advantage of those interest rates so they can do their own retirement. So you would see the supply line, shift to the right, so increase there. We got some strict government regulations. Now, if you have tried to buy a house recently, it's a huge hassle. They have to know anything and everything about your life. So this decreases the demand because people aren't able to qualify for loans as easily these days. Now, if you were to loosen up those government regulations like we had in the past, where you used to have a stated income loan, where you could walk in and tell somebody how much money you made and they would give you a loan and you qualify for whatever. It's basically they take your word for it. You see an increase in demand for those loans. The last little point that I want to make on that on the financial side is price ceiling. So basically there's usury laws that are preventing people from charging interest rates that are too ridiculous. However, the market typically controls what the interest rates are. So just as a quick recap, we got our labor market with our employees being the supply, the workforce there, and then jobs or firms being the demanders. We went over all of those little things. I'm not quite sure if I elaborated on minimum wage. It's typically right around the equilibrium. It's just preventing companies from being able to take advantage of people who make lower income, so they can't drop that the wages below that level, that minimum wage there. Went over some of the things that shift the demand line, whether it's increasing or decreasing. And then we looked at some things that increase the supply and decrease the supply. And we quickly hit on the financial markets. Again, a lot of it's extremely similar. Here we're looking at borrowers and savers being the demanders and suppliers. All right, I think that does it for Chapter 4. Thanks.